So the right to truth actually stems from our work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's archive, um, which is basically our Freedom of Information program submitted a promotion to access to information request to the Department of Justice, and we were successful and got a copy of the TRC archive that we made available online. And then we established the Right to Truth work to further this work that was started by the TRC. As with the work of, I think, with most Truth and Reconciliation commissions, the work remains unfinished. I mean, commissions are there for a set amount of time. They can't go on, inevitably. So the work, the work of the TRC is unfinished. So through the Right to Truth work, we realize that there is much more work to be done, much more work in terms of truth recovery. So a lot of Section 29 records were released, and because these deal with living persons as well, some of the information obviously is redacted, but as much as possible, we try to make these records accessible, where it's in the interest of the public to know about these records in terms of accountability and transparency. Section 29 was previously classified records, also where it pertains to where the security police were doing surveillance work on people. So those pertains to specific individuals if they had a S29 file on them. So that's what Section 29 is. So what SAHA has done in recent times, it has partnered with this academic called Dale McKinley, where we have done some work around that and published the findings from that. There were two other publications, which was The Battle Against Forgetting, remembering the work of the TRC, and as well the Transitional Roller Coaster Ride, which is all about exploring the limitations of the work of the TRC, and also to act as a prompt that more work needs to be done in terms of that. But also, as I have explained, and maybe it's not unique to South Africa, there is often a fatigue about recent history. So, funding sometimes is articulated through that. So there's limitations in terms of funding of these projects, but there's also limitations in terms of how people experience and how open they are to that. So there's obstacles that needs to be addressed, but maybe in 20 years or even longer, because often it's traumatic memory and people do not want to deal with it at this moment in time. The past informs the present, to put it, and that's where it's oversimplified, but I do think there's not enough money for archives or to do the work of archiving, but at the same time, history often repeats itself, and it's sometimes we do say we keep an archive to forget about things. Derrida, in his book, makes mention of it, that you write on a piece of paper, for example, you put it in your pocket, and you remember to forget about it. Something like really poignant like that. So I often think about, for myself, why am I doing this? And it's exactly for that reason, to educate. I have a child, so I want to educate her about the past, because it does inform the present. So if you do not learn from your past, not necessarily mistakes, but see lessons from that, then how could you possibly have an accountable government in the present or in the future? How would you hold them account? How would you promote transparency if you maintain to have a culture of secrecy, or where records are not open, where it remains classified? I think obviously within certain records there can be damaging things to individuals. So it is really an ethical and a moral choice. But yes, so even the binary of perpetrator and victim, it's problematic. There are gray areas. So these are all things that we need to be cognizant of. But at the same time, you can't just bury history. The way of keeping the archive alive is to activate it, to activate the records. And that you do through exhibitions and publications and research. Otherwise, it's a static archive. And that's not what you want. You have to tell people that there are multiple layers of history. There's not just a narrative that you have to challenge. If there's one narrative, you have to challenge the official version of the narrative. And that you do through oral history, and you read different archives together. That one archive, Saha, does not contain the whole of the liberation struggle. That's important to convey, not just to school children, but I think to the public as well, that there's not just one official narrative. What the history book tells you is not necessarily what happened, that there are many different versions of history. And I know for some people they find it difficult to grasp that history is a construction just like heritage. But I mean, the sooner you know it, the better you are off. Then you are more open-minded to accept that there's a contestation about history, and it's always influenced by who is in power, who writes the history, for example. I've looked over the history, the institutional history of Saha, and there doesn't seem to be that there was challenges involved in moving from being politically aligned to moving towards being an independent trust. I think the realization was greater that there needs to be institutions like that can stand, not necessarily neutral, but outside of the state structures, or being a parastatal, which makes it more difficult in terms of funding. But the value or the importance of civil society actors is very important in pushing back against any kind of oppressive or where there's lack of transparency or accountability, which in recent times civil society played a major role in the politics in South Africa, in pushing back against this culture of secrecy. I think first, with my hat as a director on, in terms of funding, it's very important to diversify your income stream as much as possible, not to just rely on a few big funders, because inevitably these big funders move on as their own focus shifts. So that has been really major, that Saha has not 10 years ago already started diversifying income strategies. It's almost too late, it feels. So that I would share with other similar institutions. That's really key in the continued existence of NGOs in particular. Also, alliance building is very important. We all want to establish ourselves and put our name out there. And that often means that you work by yourself, because you do not, you do not necessarily get out there by being clumped together with 2 or 3 other, because then who's going to remember you? So that's been the mindset, but that needs to change as well. NGOs have to submit joint proposals to funders. I think that's one way of continued existence and survival in a very difficult funding environment. So there's a lot that we can impart on other institutions in terms of our Freedom of Information program, as well as the Struggles for Justice program, the ways in which we have utilized the archive to promote access to the records, but also how we have used it to bring history, to make it come alive, to make the archive come alive, and to take it into schools and to universities. So we have all kinds of requests from professors wanting to bring their students. And usually it entails just a short lecture on what archives are